Hello and welcome to Story Coaching with me, your host, Charlotte McFarlane of The Writable. So, in this episode, we are going to be talking about good and bad ideas. Now, if you've been listening to the introduction episodes so far, hopefully you're starting to get behind this idea that the best way to write a book is really to be willing to try and recognize that writing is a journey of learning. You're going to have some wins, and you are probably going to fall down a heck of a lot more. And unfortunately, this is the best way to write a book, to jump in, to try, to be willing to fall and pick yourself back up again. And it's also the best way to build an author career. But I really wanted to dig into this concept of good and bad ideas, this kind of worry or limiting belief that I see over and over in beginning writers. And that's this question of whether or not an idea is really any good. I'll see on, some of the forums, it happens all the time where, someone, I presume a beginner, is posting and they're saying, I just came up with this idea, blah, 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 blah. They give a couple of lines about it and they say, is this good enough for a story? Is this good enough for a book? And the truth is, I don't know. What do you think, right? We started to talk about this in our first episode, but let's really explore it because, the odds are that you also have an idea in your head and you're thinking about writing it, but you're not really sure. And I get this fear. I get, what if you spend all your time working on it and in the end, the idea is just a flop. It just doesn't work. It just wasn't a good idea. Because that happens, right? We've heard of people who scrap an entire novel because things just don't mesh together. We call the book broken, and it's, we think it's kind of hopeless, and no one ever wants their story to end up there. I get that, but remember way back in week 1 when I told you everything was writable. I meant it 100%. But I will admit, some ideas are harder to put together than others. They're going to take more work. They're going to take more commitment, more willingness to try, right? And that's because stories aren't about the idea at all. Stories are actually about the execution. And I think we as writers have this kind of expectation that a good idea will just show up, it's going to fall into place perfectly, and that, if we have a good enough idea, that book is going to become just kind of effortless to write. I think we think this way because, when we read a book, when you read one of your favorite books, we read it and everything just fits so perfectly and everything just chugs along. It takes, maybe 8 hours to read a book. And so there's a lot of people that do that in a day or in a night, right? We stay up all night reading. And as readers, we see it and we just see it as this perfect, complete thing. And as writers, we're hoping that we'll have an idea that's good enough that everything just falls into place and is obvious and just all those pieces connect. And that, if we have a good enough idea, it's going to turn into the best thing that's ever been written. But remember, when we're reading, we're only seeing the finished product of the story. Of course, everything seems to fit together, but from the writer's point of view, there was a lot of time and effort that went into making that book seem effortless. J.K. Rowling took 6 years to write the first Harry Potter book. And J.R.R. Tolkien took 16 years to write the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Right? So it wasn't like these books just came out because the ideas were so good. They took time, they took effort, they took a lot of trying. Again, right? It's all about being willing to try. There's no magical wizard that comes along and says, hey, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. Here's that's such a good idea. Here is actually your rough draft or your full outline, because the idea is just that good. Here you go. And now it's easy for you, right? It doesn't It doesn't happen. And I think when we think about it, we understand that logically. We say, yes, of course, book takes a lot more hours to write than it does to read. Absolutely. And so we know that. We know it's going to take time, but there's still something that holds, new authors back, or sometimes even, experienced ones, just holds them back from jumping in and starting to write a book from their idea. It stops them from being willing to try. And, really, really what, think about this. Like, what would you do if I came to you or someone else came to you and said, this is the best idea I've ever heard in my entire life. This is the most amazing idea. This is going to make a best-selling book. Hands down, no questions asked. You're going to make millions, all the success you could ever want, guaranteed, because this idea that you've told me in 3 sentences, this idea is the best one I've ever heard. Would that make the writing easier? Would you now be able to just sit down and write it? I think a lot of us, we think, yeah, of course I would. I have never had that kind of success guaranteed. I want to believe that I would jump in and say, yep, if this is the only thing I have to do, great, I'm going to do it. But I know truthfully that, after that moment of excitement fades, that moment of hope and let's go, let's do this. After a moment, that's going to fade and give way to probably more of like an overwhelming dread. Like what do you mean I have to write it now? I have to write a best-selling book now? Like I have the idea, but I don't know how to turn it into a book. So when my students or my coaching clients, they come to me and they, they give me that little 3-second blurb and they say, is this a good idea? Usually I think it's because of some fear that they have, some belief or a lack of belief in themselves and in their ability to execute. It's really, they're not asking, is the idea any good? They're asking, can I do it? And I get it, because they don't, when you just know a little bit about your idea, you don't know the whole story or what that looks like. It's just an idea, right? And for most people, they don't know how to turn that idea into a book. Or sometimes they think, even if they write it, even if someone has come to them and said this is the best idea ever, they don't think that the book is going to be popular. It's not a proven idea. It's not a common idea. They think it's too weird and no one's going to want to read it. All of this doubt can really start to come in and can really hinder us as we're writing. And truthfully, the things that I want you to take away from today's episode is that there's really no such thing as a bad idea. Okay, there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's only bad execution. So any idea can become a fantastic novel if we know how to expand it and turn it into a story. And if we're willing to do that process. And this is a process that I call story planning. And just like everything else, it can be learned. Absolutely, right? And we're also going to talk about the idea of universal story structure, which is another thing that can be learned. And that's the backbone of a story. And once we understand this, we can share any idea in a meaningful way. We can build any story up to hit all the right notes and satisfy readers. So any idea any idea is going to be a good idea. All we need to know is how to execute. And more than anything today, I want you to see the power in so-called weird ideas. Just because it's never been done before doesn't mean it's not great. I know there are, thousands of books that are out there that will follow the exact same plot as, a super popular book. And that doesn't mean that those books are great. That doesn't mean that those books are super. If we look at something like Harry Potter, when it came out like 20 years ago, which is crazy, nothing like that had ever been done before. It was weird. It was out there. It was about a little boy going to wizarding school. And now it's one of, if not the highest grossing book series of all time. Right? So people want new ideas and they want great stories that are executed well. That's all that matters. Stop asking if your idea is good or not and start asking, am I willing to execute? Right? Okay. So let's get started. Really. Remember that execution is more than the idea. The idea behind many best-selling books is not that exciting. I can't tell you what some of the inspirations behind them really were when they first started developing the story, but I can tell you, I have an award-winning short story called Maple that just started with the idea of an old man sitting in a sugar bush watching sap boil into maple syrup. That's it. Sitting, watching sap boil. Not a very exciting premise, right? but after doing, the story planning and the developing of the idea, it turned into something so much more. It turned into this, story of life and death and lost connections, family, toxicity of like this go fast-paced lifestyle, and it was good enough to beat 10,000 other stories, right? So it's not about the idea. It's not about the old man sitting in the bush. That's not it. It's about the execution. It's about the willingness to go deep and to look at the core of the story. On the other hand, if you've ever read, this happens to me unfortunately a lot too, where you read the back of like the back blurb on a book, or you hear the story premise and it sounds like the most exciting story you've ever heard, right? And so you take it home and you start reading it, and it turns out, maybe the first chapter is good, and after that, it's just wildly boring. I can't tell you how many books I've started reading that sounded so exciting and I've ended up putting down and not going back to. Some interesting sounding books, some with really, fascinating premises, are not that great to read, right? The idea is good, but the execution isn't. And the result is a bad book. And that's what matters. So when you're sitting there at home in front of your typewriter and you're evaluating an idea and trying to decide if it's worthwhile to write it into a story, remember, it's not about the idea itself. It's about whether you are excited enough to do the hard work of executing. Are you willing to put in the effort to develop the story and to keep tweaking it and to keep reworking it until that execution is flawless? I really hope so, because that's what counts. That's what matters. All right, so when we find this idea, how do we actually go about developing it? Very few ideas will ever come into your head fully formed. I've heard about people for who that happens, but it has never happened for me. So if it's happened for you, congratulations. But it's not common. It's not how ideas normally come. It's never happened to me, and I honestly expect it never will. And so instead, we have to recognize that developing a story is really a discovery process, right? So we start with a basic idea, like an old man sitting in his sugar bush. And we start asking questions like why, how. So like, why is this old man sitting out there watching the sap boil instead of being inside where it's warm? Because I can tell you, I grew up on a sugar bush, and I can tell you sap takes a really, really long time to boil down into syrup, like days, right? So we ask the question, why is he out there? And we start to get some information. Like maybe that old man is sitting out there because he doesn't have the energy to walk back into the house. Well, then why doesn't he have the energy? Well, because he's sick. So then why is he in the sugar bush? Well, because it's important to him, because there's no one else to do it, because it's a connection to his family. His wife has died, all of his children have left home and don't come back to visit. Right? So a few questions and boom, suddenly we have this rich story, and that's just asking why and how and who and why, because, and we just keep asking questions. We keep going deeper, and each new piece of information is going to create a question that tells us something more about the characters, the world, or the story conflict itself. We're going to get all these pieces, and all these pieces are going to, because we've asked them, we've created them from a single idea. When we get all of these pieces, they are all going to just mesh together. And this is a dedicated process that I've come up with, and I teach and I coach others to do with their stories, sort of no matter what phase of the writing you're in. So, it works well if you're in the planning phase, but it also works really well if you're stuck somewhere halfway through and don't quite know where to go next. Or even if you're just feeling like maybe there's something more to this story. It's a great exercise that's easy to do. And again, you can do it at any point because there's always new information. And I'll just let you know, you can see this process. It's outlined in my story planning guide, which you can get for free at thewritable.com in the free guide section, right? So that's all available for you, and something that you can easily do and easily start doing, right? And so now we know, is asking these questions, that we take our idea and we start developing it into this rich, character world conflict, all of the story elements. But how do we now put that into actually a story? How do we build this rich story? What about those books? What is it that goes wrong when those books seem really promising, but they just kind of fall flat? And it's usually a problem with the story structure itself, or in other words, how the tension plays out, how the internal and the external tension kind of, mesh with each other and keep things interesting for the reader. So that's also something that's touched on in the story planning guide. And I think that it is really important to recognize that good story has this kind of backbone to it. We know that humans have been storytellers for thousands of years, and that it's caused us to just sort of have this naturally ingrained expectation of story. There's a specific way that our brain connects to and understands any kind of story, whether that's fiction or nonfiction, or even, if we're learning something out of a textbook, there's a way that our brain connects to it and a way that our brain doesn't care about it at all, right? And the truth is there are different notes to hit, and you might have heard of some of them, right? Like the inciting incident or the climax. Those are the ones that stick out to most people. But few people will pay attention to the in-between bits of the structure. And it really shows, those are the important parts. The in-between bits are the important parts. And those are the ones that I think are usually missing when we've got a story that falls flat. So, the inciting incident, the climax, those are big moments of tension. Those are extreme emotion. That's where something big is happening. But truthfully, a book can't sit up in that high tension emotional zone the whole time, because if it does, it also becomes boring, right? So, go figure. If you go for all excitement all the time, the readers will be bored. And what a reader really craves is actually emotional highs and lows. It's the ups and downs. It's the juxtaposition of high tension and low tension. It's this kind of push-pull that really engages readers. And this is true no matter what genre or setting or what the premise of the story is. This is always true. Readers want ups and downs. And I want to introduce you just quickly right now to the idea of the action cycle. And this is how everything happens in a book, or how it should happen anyhow. And it's also how things happen in life. Remember, we're using our human experience as writers. And so this is also how things happen in life. All right, so the first part is the inciting incident. And this just means that there's some kind of change. Things are not the way they were, and an incident has occurred. And it might be simple or big, like discovering you don't have eggs in the fridge after, after thinking that you did. So it's just something changes. Something is not what you expect. Right? And then there's the complication. And this is just where we think about what that means. And sometimes this can be really short, and sometimes we do want to explore it more in depth by looking at a character's thoughts. So, using our last example, if there aren't eggs in the fridge, what does that mean? Well, it means that, we can't make the cookies like we promised our kid that we would. Right? So suddenly the inciting incident means something. And usually it's something complicating or difficult. That's where the emotion comes in. Right? That's where the internal story starts to come in. Right? So this complication is followed by a crisis. And sometimes all of these pieces will come like right after each other, but sometimes they're spread out and we can really take our time playing with the elements. So the crisis is really where we start to think about how the inciting incident, so whatever happened, and the complication, what that means for us, or the negative side effects, if you want to call it that, is affecting our overarching goals and values. So if there aren't eggs in the fridge, and it means I can't make cookies for my kids, that means my kids are going to be upset, and I am also not going to live up to my values because I promised them cookies and now I can't deliver. Right? So now there's this crisis of, there's no eggs in the fridge. That means something. And now I'm starting to see the bigger picture of what that means for me. And that crisis is also going to create internal conflict. And that's really where a person has to weigh two different goals or values against each other. So I might care about the promise I made and want to make my kids happy. So that's one, that's one kind of value, or one side of the values. And I know that I could resolve that by just leaving the house to go and buy eggs. But leaving the house to go buy eggs, this is going to affect some of my other values, so I like to be, a bit of a homebody, and I like to be cozy in my comfy pants, most of the day. And if I went to the grocery store, it means that I'd have to put on real pants and leave the house, and that would be hard for me. So all of a sudden now I've got these two values, or two sets of values, opposing each other. And it means that, and they're mutually exclusive, right? So if I decide I'm going to stay home and stay in my comfy pants and not go to the grocery store, it means that I can't make the eggs and I am going to disappoint my kids. But if I want to make the eggs, or if I want to make the cookies, it means I have to go to the grocery store to get eggs, which means that I have to go against my values of staying at home. And I mean, this is kind of a silly example, but I mean, this is a real life kind of situation that we can I think connect to on at least some level, right? And so that's where the crisis really comes in, and this is the root of good conflict. It's these clashing values. Do I make my kids happy? Do I honor those values, or do I make myself happy and honor those values? And every crisis is going to eventually reach a climax, which is where some decision has to be made and some action is going to be taken. And the climax is actually about an internal resolution. So maybe I realize that, making my kids happy will make me happy, and it would be worth it to leave the house, right? So now I take action. I say, yep, I choose this set of values over this set of values. And I take action. I get dressed, I get in the car, and I head to the store. And, this feels like a lame example, and I've admitted to you all now that I mostly sit around in sweatpants all day long, but I really want to drive the point home that the cycle is not always about the big, exciting moments, too. Yes, it works really well to give them a punch, but each action your character takes, each and every single choice that they make, should follow this decision-making cycle. And every choice and every act that they either make or don't make follows this cycle, right? So in the climax, the character takes an action, they do something, and this leads to the result or the resolution. So I get dressed, I get in the car, and the result is that I am now at the grocery store. And the result leads to a new inciting instant. So, maybe the new inciting instant is just simply that I'm at the grocery store. Or maybe, I pull up, I park my car, and I see my arch nemesis, is at the grocery store heading in, and so all of a sudden now I have to face another decision. Do I go in there and risk seeing her? Do I go in there and confront her? Whatever, whatever the situation is. But this is the action cycle. And we see mini and mundane versions of this throughout a story, and we see big, exciting versions. And we see versions of this that stretch from book to book in a series, and sections that are just, a paragraph full of this action cycle. And we can see, really, this is the primary building block of a story, like any story. And we just keep sticking, when we build a book, we stick action cycles together in as many ways as we want, over and over and over again, to create that full and complex story. And the last thing that I really want to share with you is, this idea that people want new ideas. Right? So there's not good ideas that check a certain, number of boxes, and bad ideas that don't check the boxes. The only one that really matters is excitement. And recently, in the last few years, there's been this whole school of thought called writing to market. You see what's popular and you start writing books in that genre, because books that are popular have more readers. And so if you write a book that already has a readership available, you're going to have an easier time selling that book, right? That's the idea behind it. And if you are excited by an idea that's popular, don't turn away from it. Absolutely not. But don't force yourself to write something that you don't like just because it's to market. You want to write what excites you enough to do the work of developing a story. We think about I remember when like Twilight came out, and it's all about, it's this teenage vampire romance. And I remember the market of teenage vampire romances like exploded. There was thousands of books, I think, that popped up in the year after Twilight, or in the years when the Twilight series was coming out. And on the one hand, we can envision, yes, there's now hundreds of thousands of readers interested in this type of book. So a lot of them would pick up the books, absolutely. But here's the problem. Those books weren't Twilight. They weren't executed the same. So a reader may or may not like the book that was there. And it depended entirely on, guess what? The execution of that particular book. And so if you wrote something that you just, you didn't like, and you just kind of forced yourself to write it because it was to market, it was in this new genre, and your book wasn't very exciting, do you think that the reader liked that book? Do you think that the reader had a positive impression of you as a writer? Probably not, right? Now, if you were excited about the story, and I guess there's what, like 50 Shades of Grey started as a Twilight fan fiction, if I remember that correctly, right? So that's a person who was excited by this idea. And I mean, we can say what we want about the execution, but it was executed at a level where it too became a new bestseller and has movies and everything. And so, that's a situation where we had someone who was excited enough about kind of the ideas in the story that they wrote something, similar and honoring of that story, put it out there, and that excitement, that execution showed through. Right? So it's not about just getting into the right market with the right readership. It's about the execution. It's still always about the execution. And don't forget, I mean, there's always a first book in any trend, right? So Twilight was one of the first, probably wasn't the very first one, but it was one of the first teen vampire romances. Same as Harry Potter was one of the first boy goes to wizarding school stories. And those books, because they're unique, because they're special, because they're something that most people have never seen before, and because they're executed in an effective way, those books tend to do the best. People are always going to be curious and drawn to new and exciting things. Remember, we like the highs and lows. We like juxtaposition. We like things to be changing and different. Usually we we don't like things to change too much. We like to still be able to sit and read in our own, in the comfort of our own armchair, but we like things that are different. People are curious and they are drawn to new ideas. So, I mean, really, the whole point of this episode is that I want you to write your idea. Write your idea, the one that excites you. Execute it well. And honestly, just trust that there are readers out there for it. If you're excited, other people are going to be excited. If you're not excited, people are going to see that in the writing. And that is the only thing that matters, right? So if you have an idea, what I'd suggest is, decide if it excites you. Take the time to develop it before writing. And this is a step that I think some people forget about. But it, to me, it's something that I have discovered in my career is the most important thing. Take some time to develop it. And this can simply be daydreaming. My favorite thing is I go for a walk and I think about story ideas. And it's fun and it's exciting and there's no pressure. And it allows you to just sort of dig in and decide if you are excited in that idea. And the other thing that you can do a little bit more serious sort of exploring. You're asking those whys and those hows. And you might be writing that down, or you might just be, that might be part of the daydreaming, a more structured part of the daydreaming. And don't forget, I mean, I've got the story planning guide that really does walk you through this process of turning an idea into a story. That's something that's available for you, again, at thewritable.com/free guides, or I think story planning guide. And that's something that can help you out a lot as you're starting to look at this process. And truthfully, if an idea doesn't excite you, you don't have to write it. But if an idea does excite you, then know that it's a good idea and it's worth your time to develop it into a story. Yes, it's going to take time. It's going to take trying. It's going to take falling down and getting up and trying again. But really, the excitement of an idea is the only way to tell good from bad. It is literally the only thing that makes the difference. That excitement and whether or not you are willing to do the work of executing effectively. Right, so take that to heart, chew on that for a while. Let me know if you're coming up with some great ideas that really excite you, because that's one of my favorite parts about writing. I think that's just so much fun. We can start with absolutely nothing and turn it into something. We can start with nothing, and then it becomes an idea, and then it becomes a bunch of ideas, and then it becomes a story. And that's the beauty of writers. So have fun with that. Oh my goodness. Happy writing. Keep it up. And I will see you guys next week for our next episode.